Everybody. Okay, so we are very lucky this afternoon because, well, we won't have siesta time, but at least we have a very, very good panel here with three leading scholars on the issue we are discussing these days. First one is Antonio Costa Pinto, very well known for all of you, research professor at the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon. He's a very well-known scholar. He has written on fascism, on the Portuguese case, and also he has published many books on fascism, dictatorships, and conservative forces in interwar Europe. He's going to talk about Salazar's dictatorship and the diffusion of authoritarian models in the era of fascism. After him, Tim Kirk, professor of European history at Newcastle University. He's a specialist on Austria and Central Europe in general. And he's going to talk about from the state that nobody wanted to the true state, building dictatorship in the context of transnational counter-revolution in Austria. And finally, Alejandro Quiroga, who is a senior researcher, we can call you, I think, of history at the University Complutense of Madrid. He's very well known for his works on the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, but also for his studies on sports and nationalism. And he's going to talk about architects of dictatorships, Primo de Rivera and Mussolini in the 1920s. So, you know, you have 15 minutes each, and I am going to be very strict with the time, just to have time for discussion afterwards. So, whenever you want.
Oops. It works?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good afternoon. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation to present a paper on this conference. It's wonderful, in this case, a moment to see old friends, to make new friends, and to meet also colleagues and to discuss the topic of fascism. Some projects or some papers, that's the case of this one of mine. I arrived to this paper just by chance. I'm going to be very brief. A couple of years ago, a Danish colleague of mine, we were discussing, in another conference, a topic about authoritarian political representation, etc. And he told me, did you know that, he's an economic historian, did you know that when the National Socialism invaded Denmark, a group of entrepreneurs wrote to the king suggesting to build an authoritarian regime based on the institutions of the Portuguese new state? I said, no. I was, of course, I was already my knowledge about the Roman Catholic diffusion of Salazarism as a model, a more palatable model compared with Italian fascism, etc., etc. Yes, but that's, more of the same, But in Denmark, quite frankly, I was not aware of that, of the arrival of Salazar into this country in 1940-41. And that's how I decided to invite a series of colleagues, several colleagues, experts, as a matter of fact, sometimes on not just on fascism, but also on conservative and authoritarian elites to build a project on perceptions of Salazar by fascist and conservative elites in interwar Europe and Latin America. Okay, and that's the story I'm going to introduce here. Basically, the idea is that in the late 30s, Salazar is perceived as a sort of an authoritarian third way in the era of fascism without the radical dimensions associated with fascism. Very popular among especially radical right and conservative elites. And this process goes from the mid-30s till even after the Second World War. Some of the collaborationist regimes, for instance, under Axis rule, are going to take institutional dimensions of Salazar to build this kind of regimes, even in the 1940s. I'm going to be very brief. When we look at process of political regime change in the 1930s, Salazar, of course, is not exactly the only model. But there is a tension that sometimes I did enjoy very much this book of Kurt Weyland, because many of you might know what he does is he studies the tensions, the processes of conversions and tensions between some authoritarian political families of the right. A well-known topic, radical right, fascists, etc., all over. And he states, and it's true, there is empirical evidence to that much of the autocratic wave of the 1920s and 30s emanated from what he calls the double deterrent effect, driven by fear of communists, but also this fascism, I'm now reading on Japan, this fascism from below. Because the majority of these elites are well-established conservative and radical right elites. They don't like very much the masses, mass society and mass mobilization, although they are going to build regimes that frame this masses. Okay. There are just three that are important for this third authoritarian wave. Three. No more than three. Primo de Rivera, that is very influential in Latin America, namely in Argentina. Many Latin American radical right-wing conservatives take inspiration from the Primo de Rivera dictatorship in Spain. The first one is Uriburu, the dictator of Argentina, just for 2 years. Anyhow, Dollfuss, but unfortunately for Austrians, or fortunately, I will say unfortunately, since after Dollfuss came something much worse. It was National Socialism. Dollfuss Austria could have been, and it is, for many radical right-wing conservative in Central and Eastern Europe, has a strong impact. For instance, Tiso in Slovakia during the Second World War, just to give an example, and the Salazar state. So the hypothesis behind this paper is that Salazarism was one of the main protagonists of the diffusion of this third way during the era of fascism, one that embodies authoritarian, especially authoritarian corporatist models. I'm not going to develop, but the basic association is corporatism, right? Elitist corporatism. I'm not talking about workers and unions. We're talking about how a dictatorship of the era of fascism, the majority of them perceiving, adapting, modeling on building based mainly on Italian institutions of fascism, not of National Socialism. National Socialism does not play, not even a role model in terms of institutional diffusion for this kind of elites all over the world. The model is undoubtedly Italian fascism. Many of them go to social policies, this and that, but I'm not going to discuss this from National Socialism, but it's Italian fascism. Is Italian fascism the innovation and the perception for the worldwide radical right of the era of fascism is Italian fascism. It's banal to say it, but I think it's important to underline this. So why the Portuguese new state? Well, the Portuguese new state, it's a blend of what? First, an elitist procedure associated with a crisis, not a liberal democracy, but a semi-democracy. I'm not going to discuss the nature of many of these democratic regimes in the interwar period, because some of them are not full-fledged democracies. They are oligarchic type of liberal regimes, like in Latin America, like in Portugal, the Portuguese First Republic, like in Central and Eastern Europe. Many of these regimes do no process of democratization after the First World War, but okay. First, what is the origin? The origin of the Portuguese new state is a military coup, a successful military coup. In this military coup, of course, you have generals, you have young lieutenants influenced by fascism, you have even fascists, as a matter of fact, you have conservative elites, you have Republicans, but you have a military coup. The most interesting dimension in analytical terms, in comparison, of the transition towards authoritarianism in Portugal is the following: a military dictatorship that, in a way, opened the space for a civilian dictator, Oliveira Salazar, a conservative Catholic university professor of Coimbra, Minister of Finance, that is going to be the builder, let us say, of the regime. It's very rare. You have Pilsudski, but Pilsudski was a military. You have Horthy, but Horthy was a military. It's not every day in the interwar period that you have military dictatorships that, in a way, become a civilian authoritarian regime. Point number one. Point number two, Salazar, a strong dictator. Salazar is a dictator that centralized decision-making. The personality of the dictator, and this is very important, of course, in dictatorships, the personality of the leader is basically an institutionalist, in a way pragmatic, blending conservative values with typical reactionary Roman Catholic values, full stop. Third, it's probably the most important one, the nature of the single party, National Union, União Nacional. Banal. 80% of the single parties of the dictatorships inspired by fascism are not fascist parties. Our dictatorships are single parties exactly like the União Nacional. Even the name, Camp of National Union, Poland. I could give several examples. What is this single party? First, is an elitist single party. It's controlled by the government. Plays a very important role in unifying the conservative coalition that supports the dictatorship and the military dictatorship, conservative Republicans, reactionary monarchists, and fascists. The idea that the blue shirts are dissolved, it's also a banal event in the interwar period. Nothing special there. Half go to the single party, the other half are repressive. The same is going to happen in Brazil, blah, 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 blah. Nothing new. Point number four, a constitution that unifies liberalism with corporatism in formal terms. Not a big novelty in a way. As we know, Italian fascism didn't create the fascist constitution, as everybody knows. Although the majority of these dictatorships do create new constitutions that, in a way, frame the nature of this regime. And Portuguese corporatism, the majority of the documents, the legal basis of Portuguese corporatism, are inspired by Italian fascism. La Carta del Lavoro, it's 50% of the Estatuto do Trabalho Nacional, as in Spain, as in Vichy France, and in many other places. We know this. But the Portuguese regime unifies social corporatism in the sense that organize interest groups and unions, dissolve unions into a frame, a statist frame for interest organizations, and what I call political corporatism, a new form of organic type of representation to replace, of course, democracy and liberalism. But in the majority of the cases, there is nothing also new. The Portuguese regime to create militia organizations, like the Legião Portuguesa, for instance, like the Portuguese Youth, also an official youth organization, the typical paramilitary groups, although controlled by the state, controlled by the government, not by the party. No weak party, weak single parties. And the rest of the panoply of the dictatorships of the Eurofascism, a propaganda bureau led by a fascist intellectual, a very modernist fascist intellectual, without the same type of political culture of the dictatorships. And finally, although not as in Spain, because in Spain, in a way, due to the crusade nature of the association between Franco and the Catholic Church during the Civil War, you have dimensions that are not present in the Portuguese regime. The dictator Salazar responds to the National Assembly, not to God, as Franco. But a very close association between the Portuguese Roman Catholic Church and Salazar, just by chance, or not by chance, a Catholic dictatorship, a Catholic dictator. So I'm going to be, I hope that I still have 5 minutes. Yes. When we look at the interwar periods, we must, let us say, acknowledge the reality of gravity centers. I think the theory of gravity centers is very productive to analyze, for instance, the role of Italian fascism as a gravity center, as a novelty in terms of authoritarian political institutions. That's what is at stake. Francisco Campos in Brazil couldn't care less about, he's a law professor. He's a law professor serving a dictator that comes, as a matter of fact, from oligarchic liberalism, Getúlio Vargas. What is he going to adapt in the Constitution? He's going to read fascist, sometimes nationalist, Italian jurists. That's what we read. You want an organization of youth? I write one. I write the bylaws of one. You want a structure of a more listed single party, etc., etc., etc. So Salazarism was, I think, in the interwar period, an example of how an authoritarian gravity center can unintentionally project. It's not the product of huge propaganda. Salazarism doesn't have the capacity, the political capacity. It's not comparable to Italian fascism. Italian fascism has a clear, let us say, a clear strategy of propaganda worldwide of its institutions. Send university professors of corporatist law, of fascist law, all over the world, from China to Japan, etc., etc., etc. Salazarism is a gravity center that I will stress this point, that unintentionally project and produce diffusion efforts. So how and why did Salazar inspire some of the new political institutions? And I'm going to be very brief. First, why Salazarism? It's here. In 1937, in these two phrases. In 1937, the propaganda secretary of Salazarism adopts a test of, an essay of Salazar, A Peaceful Revolution, How to Build a State. And the Salazarism consolidated during the 1930s was perceived by conservative elites just as Salazar intended, and was defined in this publication as an authoritarian, a Catholic, and a corporatist alternative to liberal democracy. Full stop. That's it. as one Jesuit priest wrote in 1937, and he is there, he's around there. When he mentioned important Catholic statements of very interesting ones, of course, Dolphus, but that's going to be over in a year. Gil Robles is going also to be over since the reactionary, let us say, conservative coalition of Robles is going also to vanish in a way of the political arena, and all Salazar emerged as the leader of a successful authoritarian regime. So then, and I'm going to be, I love this quotation by an American New York Times journalist to go to Latin America, and he visits. He was not aware of, not even probably where Portugal was. And he interviewed a series of elites and priests and bishops, etc. And he heard about Salazar. Banal. Conservative Catholics, 1930s, fascism, the war in Europe already. What was the good authoritarian model connected with Roman Catholic? Salazar. That was reasonably obvious in the political culture of the majority of Latin American countries. But, so we have the Catholic root, obvious, especially after the end of the Dollfuss, let us say, corporatist, clerico-fascist, whatever, now in terms of definitions. As you know, all, in a way, national historiographers in the 1980s and 90s, at least, of the 20th century, had this debate. Fascism, not fascism. Salazarism, fascism, not fascism. Francoism, fascism, not fascism. Dollfuss, clerico-fascist, fascist, authoritarian. I don't remember anymore. There was another one on Austria. But the same happens in Chiang Kai-shek or Japan. Fascism, not fascism, fascism from below, fascism from above. Everything is there in the majority of the countries that suffer this kind of experiences. So when we examine the corpus of this new authoritarian constructs, we see it's a blend of this elitist dimension is basically Action Française, Action Española, Lusitanian integralism in Portugal. It's there. Almost everything is there. With the elitist appropriation of institutions of Italian fascism. Vichy. The main projective constitution of Vichy is based on the 1933 constitution. Vichy represents probably the most or the stronger group of sympathizers of Salazarism who are trying to negotiate with other segments of the Vichy elite a new regime. I'm not going to develop, but it's very present to conclude. Tiso's Slovakia. It's very interesting, although Tiso's, for instance, under Nazi rule, under National Socialist rule. Tiso's, of course, is very much influenced by Dollfuss or even by Seipel, by Roman Catholic authoritarian corporatist elements of the Dollfuss regime. But the 1939 Constitution adopts very important parts from the 1933 Constitution in Portugal. Gombo's Hungary, exactly the same. Authoritarian alternatives to liberal democracy before the radicalization of the war, before, of course, Lazai, and you know, in 44, 43, 45, Paltelecki, it's the most important example as prime minister, the same. I'm not going to. Denmark, I've mentioned already, because it's important to mention that it goes further than the Roman Catholic cultural backgrounds. And Metaxas Greece, I'm not going to as a matter of fact, I'm based on a chapter by Aristotle Kalis, where Salazar is present among, and Salazar is present among the institutional and ideologues of Metaxas. In the end, of course, we know that Metaxas is not going to create a constitution or institutions. To conclude very briefly, after this tour of political experience, what we have in the era of fascism, I will say, is mainly the appropriation by radical right and conservative elites of institutions that are institutionalized for the first time by Italian fascism. The local dimension of Italian fascism, it's not important. The fact that the Camera dei Fasci delle Corporazioni was just created in the late 30s, that's not important. What is important is basically the body of legislation that supports Italian fascism as a new form of political regime. Personalized leadership, autonomy from parliamentary rule, corporatism as a new form of political representation are, in a way, the cement that make, in a way, not just fascism and the export of fascist institutions, but also that legitimates other alternatives to democracy in the era of fascism. And in this case, Salazar is clearly one of the models that influence many dictatorships in the interwar period. That's it. Thank you.
You're going this way. Sorry.
Does this work?
There you go.
Oh, does this work?
I think it does.
Yes,
yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
it works.
does.
Yeah, probably approach.
Yeah.
I think I have a presentation, but maybe I don't. No, I think it's not copied over.
Was that in a PDF or was that?
Might be separate. How do you? Can I change to?
What you have? You have
I'm in
a
Madrid,
Presentation
maybe.
Madrid here, maybe.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, thank you. That's mine. I swapped them over. I think. Yeah. Right. I do have a. What's the Spanish for slideshow? Animaciones.
Oh, yeah. Here. Is that?
Right. Okay. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but as you can see, it's a very crude one, and this is the Chancellor. Dictator Adolphus that we've heard so much about, his short-lived career regime. I'll try to be very brief as well. So just to make a few points, really. First of all, apologies for the very long title. It was a working title that tried to incorporate all the elements of what I thought we were meant to be doing. So what I'd like to start by saying is that Austria has been, Michael Mann called Austria the most fascist country in Europe because it had not one but two fascist movements, and they were different and complementary. It had what Gerhard Botz has called a clerical, aristocratic, Italian-facing, Mediterranean-style fascism in the Heimwehr, and then it had a small-town, petty bourgeois, Nazi, nationalistic, goose-stepping kind of fascism in the Nazi party. So that's one thing. So it makes, it seems to make Austria, because there's so much disagreement about what kind of regime the Dollfuss-Schuschnigg regime was, not only a good laboratory for exploring the relationship between fascism and conservatism, but also for exploring the relationship between the two different kinds of fascism. And Austria straddles that border in Europe between a Nazi north and a fascist south, as it were. I'd like to make another point as well. My personal instinct is to think of fascism not as being monogenetic. So, I accept all we've heard about the March on Rome and the importance of Mussolini, but it seems to me that all fascisms, all elements of the radical right had deeper roots in a kind of transnational context in Europe that came about from urbanization, economic change, the experience of the war, the role of the Catholic Church in the papal bulls Rerum Novarum and so on, which, in a sense, I think probably Salazar transcribed for his constitution, more or less. So that you have parallel developments. And as is the way of transnational networks, they were mutually influential. And the power shifted between, or the influence shifted between them. So that's a couple of initial points on the general issues. On Austria, and because I'm not in a Latin space, actually, I'm in a transalpine space. So I'm used to comparisons not with Portugal or Spain or Italy, a little bit with Italy, but more with Germany. So some of the points I'll now make about, that's my points on transnational foundations, the things that were widespread across Europe. Peculiarities of Austrian history. What was different about Austria? One I've already mentioned, that it had two fascist movements. Another thing that was important, and particularly important in relation to Germany and Italy, did not have a divided labour movement. The labour movement was strong and united. There was no communist split in Austria. There was an attempt at it, but it didn't work, possibly under the influence of the failed experiments in Bavaria and Hungary. More than half of the population of Vienna, man, woman and child, was a card-carrying member of the Social Democratic Workers' Party in the late 1920s. So that's another thing. And of course, all these complexities have meant that Austria has particular historiographical issues. One is a mythology of having been the first victim of Nazi expansion, which has shaped the historiography not only of Nazism and the Anschluss, but also of the period that went before, which has been rescued historiographically from any taint of fascism and called an authoritarian state. And then second, a later one that is a corollary to that is the Austro-fascism debate that's continuing. Is the Dollfuss-Schuschnigg regime as a whole between 1934 and 1938 fascist? Or is it semi, demi, quasi, para, one of those other things? Okay, so they're the initial points. What I tried to focus on, because I think this is one of the interesting things, is how you get a dictatorship out of a democratically elected political party and how you build that. You know, how does that come about? Why does that come about? And what I'm persuaded of now, and I'm not really going to change my mind because I'm about to retire, so I don't think I have to, is that counter-revolution was there from the start. The Christian Social Party accepted It had done very well democratically when there was limited franchise in the 1890s. So it accepted the parliamentary democracy that was established in 1919, but counter-revolution was there from the start. And there were two ways in which it manifested itself in the 1920s and 30s. First of these, and we're all very familiar with it now because of the brilliant work of Gerwart and co on this, is the paramilitary violence that around the hub of Austria, Hungary, Bavaria, Italy, was a centre of paramilitary violence that simply ignored boundaries and actually operated within what is obviously a transnational environment, the former Habsburg Empire. It's an interesting quandary. Is the Habsburg Empire as a state transnational? So that you have this kind of context of war and peace, of gun running, right from the start. And you have in early 1920s Austria a situation not unlike Northern Ireland, where all factions have paramilitary wings. Everything is militarized. Both by support from Italy, from Hungary, particularly in the early days from Bavaria, with the Organisation Kanzler, ORCA. But it's not just the radical right that is paramilitary, and not just the clerical radical right. So the Heimwehr becomes a kind of wing, paramilitary wing of what's called in Austria the clerical conservative camp, Christian Social Party. But of course the Nazi Party, which is much more marginal and smaller to begin with, has the stormtroopers, and the Labour movement has the Republikanische Schutzbund as its military wing. So that is one of the contexts. But it's the Heimwehr who kind of make the weather in all this. The Schutzbund is always on the defensive, and until the 1930s, the stormtroopers are relatively marginal. The other context to counter-revolution is the ideological, intellectual continuities in the Christian Social Party itself, in the leadership. And particularly influential in that is Ignaz Seipel, who was Chancellor from 1922 to 1924, negotiated what was the first international bailout in history to Austria from the League of Nations, underwritten by the Bank of England, but basically an austerity program of the kind that we now associate with the IMF, which enabled Seipel as an austerity conservative chancellor to slash public spending and undermine the welfare and reverse the welfare provisions to some extent that had been won in the revolution. So already there were counter-revolutionary gains as conservative policy. When he came back as chancellor in 1926 to 29, it was as a much more ideologically driven leader who by this time had got into what he called the true state, true democracy, in which, and he'd written about this already as a young theologian before the First World War, or before the First World War, arguing that really a leader must be accountable to nobody. Basically, it was an anti-pluralist argument. A true leader could not be accountable to anybody because he would be influenced by sectional interests. So if you have a bourgeois party in parliament representing business and industry, or a workers' party representing unions and industrial workers, their sectional interests, a true leader had to rise above that and pay no heed to parliament. And increasingly during the late 1920s, that became the thrust of arguments from within the still democratically elected Christian Social Party. Conditions became much sharper in Austria from 1927, when a war veteran and a child were shot dead by Heimwehr, by Frontkämpfer, right-wing paramilitary snipers in a regional demonstration. The real trouble started when the murderers were acquitted in July in Vienna and prompted workers' riots, which enabled then the right, the conservatives, to bring back the threat of Bolshevik revolution. All social democratic workers were maligned as Bolshevik revolutionaries who would overturn, ironically overturn democracy. There were calls for a reform of the constitution already. Dollfuss had actually called for a corporate constitution in 1915, during the war, in fact. But there were now increasing calls for a kind of corporate constitution. And it may well have been that Salazar was an influence here in this, or Italy. National election, I've lost my thread. It came to nothing in the short term. The constitution was revised in 1931, but not in the way that the radical right wanted, the Heimwehr wanted. I think what was more important, and I think this is something that you still have to pay attention to, is that the Christian Social Party, the Conservative Party, was willing to accept democracy as long as it worked for them. There were elections in 1930 where they had already been losing electoral support, and they ended up with a majority of 1 in complicated circumstances, which meant they had to rely on the Heimwehr, the radical wing of the paramilitary wing of the party, as it were, which had campaigned independently in order to stay in power. At the same time, the Heimwehr itself were ready to march on Vienna. Julia mentioned it this morning, the Prima Putsch, 1921. In 1931, it was a complete failure. It wasn't like the March on Rome. But there it was. The example was there. What really mattered in the end was that, particularly after regional elections in 1932, where there was something of a Nazi landslide. So the support for the Nazis in Austria in 1932 had a breakthrough very similar to that in Germany. More convincingly, in 1933, in Innsbruck, the very, very Catholic, and we've been told to think of Catholics as immune to Nazism in Germany, certainly. In Innsbruck, they scored 43% of the vote in perhaps the most Catholic province in Austria, at which the regime took panic and found an excuse to suspend parliament. It happened through exploiting a parliamentary procedure whereby, in a very Austrian kind of way, very operetta, all 3 presidents of the parliament dissolved it, and then there was nobody to recall it. And Dollfuss seized on this opportunity to close down Parliament altogether, and started in 1933 to institute reforms which were not a corporate constitution yet, or even a new constitution, but were piecemeal suppressions of opposition and civil rights and so on. And during this time, there's a very close relationship between Dollfuss and Mussolini. The letters were published after the war in English and have now been republished recently in German as well, where you can see Mussolini trying to put pressure on Dollfuss to turn Austria into a fascist state and into a client state of Italy. And you can also see Dollfuss fending him off, because he also has to please a constituency or constituencies in his own country which don't want that quite, or not quite yet. But paints himself into a corner, so that in 1934, he's forced to bring back a Heimwehr man as interior minister, which is effectively to unleash the right-wing paramilitary onto the labour movement. Prompts a clash which is referred to as the Austrian Civil War in February 1934, and that provides the excuse to suppress the opposition entirely and bring in the corporate state. So in May 1934, the corporate constitution is promulgated, the Ständestaat, and there have been lots of discussions, lots of debates about what that actually meant and what it should be called, whether it was fascist, and so on. So the idea of a constitutional dictatorship is one such term that's been used. A mass party is created, as it were, from above, the Vaterländische Front, the Patriotic Front, and at the same time, Austria is drawn into the Italian orbit through the Rome Protocols, which creates a new kind of international situation with Italy's ambitions before 1938 to create a sphere of influence in southeastern Europe, southeast central Europe. And then, of course, in July 1934, the Nazis assassinate Dollfuss, helped, prompted, or whatever, by Hitler, and that brings the Dollfuss experiment not to an end, but it passes it on to somebody else. So it doesn't end with Dollfuss and his death in 1934. Kurt von Schuschnigg takes over. Schuschnigg had been a kind of prime mover in many of the moves to an authoritarian constitution. He was the one who'd suggested the War Economy Enabling Act of 1917 to pass emergency measures, modelled on the German use of presidential decrees in 1930. So Schuschnigg took over and stepped into the role quite easily. The debate in Austria has been whether then, certainly after a couple of years, there was a defascistization, it's a dreadful word, to get rid of Heimwehr men out of the government, and what had been semi-fascist became less so. It's still an open question. I think my take on it is rather take on the corporate society is rather different. It seems to me that the dictatorships that have been talked about this morning were very successful ones. Mussolini lasted 20 years till he fell in with a bad lot. Salazar, how many decades did Salazarism last? I can remember it ending. 40, yeah. Franco, I was here before Franco died, so he must have lasted a long time as well. The end of Dollfussism, as it were, was already written in right from the beginning, I think, because what I've said about this is it's Volksgemeinschaft ohne Volk. These institutions and corporate organizations were created, among them a youth movement, the Österreichers, Young Folk, but people didn't join that. They were empty. There were imitations of fascist structures and affiliated organizations, but they simply didn't work. And I think the Volksgemeinschaft itself in Germany is rather a corporate idea as well, which did work, but in Austria it didn't. There were empty institutions, and there were continuing conservative policies which militated against it being seen as fascist. It was a very deflationary economic policy, more in line with the bailout and the Bank of England than it was with the war economy in Germany to the north. So you have, for German-speaking Austrians, an example of a booming economy, a successful country to the north, making an international reputation, and a backwater that's stagnating and everybody's impoverished, or driven to destitution, as in the case of Marie Jahoda's study of the unemployed of Marienthal. And then among the intellectuals, there's a kind of rapprochement. So I forgot to mention Ottmar Spann, from my notes earlier, the author of Der wahre Staat, lecturer, professor at the University in Vienna, who influenced generations of students with his anti-liberal, quasi-fascist, let's say, philosophy, sociology, economics. By 1936, the Spannkreis was operating within what Janek Wassermann has called Black Vienna, as a kind of adjunct to, as much to the Nazi Party as to the Christian social right. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of personnel, in terms of ideas, in terms of structures, between the two apparently distinct and distinctive movements. And there is no popular support, I think, for the regime. It's put in place by a party that was losing popular support in elections very rapidly when it came to power, and continued to bleed or leach support to the Nazis throughout the mid-1930s. So it was so you can see the enthusiastic crowds on the streets of Vienna in 1938 were not there by accident. So in terms of coming to conclusions and questions, what I would say is that both Austrian fascisms had deep 19th century roots. The Christian Social Party of the 1890s, led by Karl Lueger, was pioneering prototype rather, in the use of rabble-rousing anti-Semitism, in manipulation of elections, in pork barrel politics and so on, but operating in a different kind of context. And the continuities between the thinking in that party go right through to certainly the 1930s. The Austrian right, and similarly with the Nazis, the earliest National Socialist parties were in German-speaking Bohemia and across the border eventually in Bavaria and Austria itself. The Austrian right was part of wider networks, very much so. There's very much a rapprochement with Italy in 1933-4, but it was certainly, the Nazi Party was certainly run by Germany. There were blurred boundaries between conservatives and fascists. It's difficult to say, where the policy of an elected Christian social party stops, and you could say the Civil War or the new constitution, but where the policies of a fascist or ostensibly fascist movement begin. And there was a fluidity and an overlap between the clerical right and Nazism. We think of them as different things, but they very much overlapped. And then finally, was the state Austro-fascist or authoritarian? And the questions there remain open. It's still an ongoing controversy, so to speak. So I think I'll leave that there and hope that I've given some kind of prompts for thought or discussion, at least.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, just... What?
No, don't worry. Stay
I was
there.
going to say,
Come here.
I had one last slide there. Just want to say I had this one last slide, actually, which is, this is a newspaper from Hitler's hometown, Braunau. Two issues, a fortnight apart. In one of them, it's the headlines are all for the rally to Schuschnigg's plebiscite to say yes to a Christian, corporate, authoritarian German Austria, more long-winded than my title. And 2 weeks later, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. So, yeah. It's not very long.
Alex. Okay, thank you. Alex, do you want water?
Gracias. Well, it seems that I'm getting a bit of a cold, so you will excuse my...
If it's not COVID, everything is okay.
I couldn't tell you at this point. I'll tell you tomorrow. Okay, what I would like to do today, essentially, is to draw a comparison between how the dictatorship of Benito Mussolini was built and how the dictatorship of Miguel Primo de Rivera was built in the 1920s. The paper is divided into those points that you have there. on your right-hand side. Now, they look like quite a lot, but actually I'll go through them very, very quickly. Okay, we all know, we're all familiar with the post First World War crisis. So in that respect, I'll just go through it, just to highlight a number of common points, not only in the case of Spain and Italy, but as well what's going on throughout the entire Europe, and in particular those countries that ended up with authoritarian dictatorships in the 1920s. There's Bulgaria, Greece for a while, Portugal, Yugoslavia, and Hungary, of course, and Italy. So we have very similar narratives in terms of counter-revolutionary narratives. We got similar social support for those in self-styled national leaders. We do have a number of common enemies, essentially of the working class movement, but as well in some occasions, or most occasions as well, national minorities or sub-state nationalisms, depending on which side of Europe you're talking about. And there is a common idea of the need of a charismatic leader, meaning many things and leading to different processes of charismatization, which is something that Professor Callis has written quite a lot on, and as well in many cases to populist discourses. So all this comes together, and that is sort of the common ground or the fertile soil in which these regimes are going to operate. Having said that, if we think about the foundational moments of both regimes, these are, in some respects, somehow different, in the sense that the March of Rome, as Julia Albanese has told and taught us, was many things, was a coup d'etat, was a revolution, but it was as well nothing, as in the sense that it was theatrical and it had a performative, if you want, feature in that sense. Bottom line, Mussolini gets to power being a minority party within a coalition of liberals and conservatives. So they went to the elections in 1921. This is the Spanish military on the 15th of September 1923 declaring a state of war. It's a different manner, it's a different way to understand how to take power in that sense. But apart from that, is the starting point of a national moment. It's and this moment is going to be sort of idealized and mythologized, if you want, later on. No problem with that. It does happen in almost every single dictatorship, as it happened in the Portuguese dictatorship. This idea that the foundational moment of all these regimes, but the initial governments were, in the case of Italy, very clearly coalition governments, and in the case of Spain, well, no, because it was a military government, a military directorate. And this is important in the sense that the way dictatorships are going to develop over time. If you want this in pictures, this is what we have. I mean, Mussolini, even if he didn't like it, he was a civilian. this is the first government in Spain. That meant a number of things. That meant that the ability to change things was much bigger and broader and it was stronger in the case of Primo de Rivera than in the case of Benito Mussolini, at least all the way up to 1925, I would argue. There are transformations within the Spanish state by Mussolini in that position of power since the very beginning. What we have is permanent censorship. We don't have that in Italy, even if Mussolini used to threaten with that every 2 weeks, but the reality is that it was imposed in a gradual manner through illegal persecution of opponents, in the sense that the persecution of opponents in the case of Spain is outside the Constitution and any sort of legislation. When we argue that obviously political violence in the case of Italy was as well illegal, even by any sort of legal standards. There is the creation of a national militia, the Somata Nacional, basically 3-4 days after the coup d'etat in the case of Spain. But this is very important, a militia created from above by and controlled by the military since the very beginning as well. Not the case of the Fascia di Combattimento, obviously. In any case, it's not that there was no political violence, obviously, in Spain, that there were no civic militias in Spain. There were, but the official one, the one created by the government, is this one. But there are already fairly sort of fundamental changes within the state structure. And part of the construction of this dictatorship means change, new municipal statute and a new provincial statute that, by the way, it actually fundamentally changed the constitutional structure of Spain, because the implication of the provincial statute is the abolition of the Catalan Mancomunitat, of the Catalan regional government. In terms of social support, I think it's always interesting to see how Mussolini managed to gradually incorporate a number of conservative groups, not just political groups, but as well members of employer associations, of industrial associations, and so on, gradually within the regime. In the case of Primo de Rivera, is probably the other way around, in the sense that the coup d'etat had a good deal of direct support by many different groups. I mean, all the political groups of the right, some liberals critical of the restoration regime, but as well, and in a very sort of important manner, by employers, by banking associations, by all sort of some civilian associations of the middle classes. The very fact that the peseta went up in the stock market the day of the coup d'etat, I think, is very, very telling of who was socially supporting the regime. It led to a good deal, I won't get into that as well, of consent or acquiescence, if you want, that of people saying, well, not my business for the time being, dictatorship could be all right, we'll see how it goes. So it's not support, but it's like, well, okay, I'm not going to fight, certainly, this. And another, I think, main difference is as well that within this creation of the two parties, the fascist parties on the one hand and the Unión Patriótica on the other hand, yet again, crucial distinction: the fascist party is a party that is created as a tool to take power via parliament, in a way, or at least they went for the elections. Unión Patriótica never went to any elections because there was a party created from above, from power, once the dictatorship had been established. And that we'll see is sort of a crucial difference. In the shape of, pictures, you got what I've seen, which is mentioned Primo de Rivera, Martínez, the military men, and the mobilization of the population from above, and with all the sort of, in this case, local/regional connotations, female mobilization as well. Everything sort of controlled mobilization, if you want. This is again the case. There's this 1928 and a model as well of mobilization in Madrid. Very little, not really as well organized. This is another sort of mobilization blending the Catholic Church in a nationalist ceremony with the military and the public. Yeah, is in El Retiro in Madrid, but it's quite of a different sort. Now, what we have by excuse me, by 1925 is that we could say that I think Primo de Rivera is more authoritarian than Mussolini, or at least he does have more power or the ability to change things more than in the case of Mussolini, that only from 1925, but all the way up till October, November 1926, with the end of the fascistissime laws. So this, I don't know how to translate that into English, the super fascist law. That with that legislation, actually, that began to create sort of proper dictatorship. Having said that, the paradox is that, from day one, Primo de Rivera is saying, okay, is that center of gravity? In the case of Italy, is that, if you want, authoritarian third way, but with the center of gravity is in Mussolini's Italy, and it's constant. The reference is not that much to fascism, certainly to Mussolini. He's been the guide for all of us. We have to follow, and of course, the following sentence is always, but in Spain we're going to do it in a different manner, and we're going to do it, the way we have to operate here. We know how to operate. We have this sort of two trends, sort of kind of similar speed here, what we're going to find from 1926 onwards, with or late 25, with the creation of the civil directory in the case of the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, is that those trends are going to take sort of different directions. The creation of a number of institutions, the National Assembly, in the case of Primo de Rivera, the education reform that led to the clash with the Catholic Church, the creation of a corporatist state also led to a clash with the Catholic trade unions, that they thought they should be part of the model. And the end result of all this was that the loss of support, of social support of the dictatorship. And perhaps this is something that we see as well in 1929 with the failure of the constitutional model, which is something that somehow indicated that the dictatorship had some problems to institutionalize itself. But a constitutional model that Primo de Rivera literally sent to Mussolini for comments, right? Not for approval, but certainly. Benito, could you please tell me what this is? Whether this is cool, whether this is what was your view about the Constitution? What is going to happen in this civil directory is that the commitment of the mobilization of the Unión Patriótica and the members of the Sumaten is going to prove weak. So it's all very well to go out to the streets and support the regime and go there with the banners and all the flags or whatever, but it's basically in a time of crisis when we actually learned whether that support is fairly strong. And there were two main crises in the year 1929, in which we can see that the support could be very big in terms of numbers of members of the party, of even members of the Somaten. But then, when it came out in the streets to defend the political regime, Primo de Rivera found he had some problems. First, with the students, the regime tried to mobilize Unión Patriótica supporters and the youth movement of the Unión Patriótica, in actually, I think in this very building as well, there was part of the fighting. But bottom line, students are not defeated, and the members of the Unión Patriótica actually have to leave the university. And the solution for the regime, the way to sort of crush the university student upheaval was, as ever, with military men, right? So in that sense, you could see that the regime is not able to mobilize its supporters. Another very clear case is the case of the insurrection of Sánchez Guerra as well in January 1929, and when the garrison in Ciudad Real rose against the government. The members of Somaten and Unión Patriótica in Ciudad Real did absolutely nothing. They stayed at home. Meant that, you know, your ability to mobilize your supporters in a time of crisis is not really there. Primo de Rivera realized about that, and he decided that he was going to go for what it was later called, or some scholars have called the totalitarian turn of the regime, which is to endow the Unión Patriótica and the Somaten with police rights and the right to arrest anyone and to interrupt any sort of meeting and break into any sort of meeting and to draft list of political opponents and be able to fire anyone as well from a public officer, from any post. And the reaction here is that many of those public officers and many members of the Unión Patriótica actually left the party. So when we are heading towards a more radical position of the party, the result is a loss of support as well. This is something that was published by the Graphic, the British magazine, in which, and it's entitled, it's very telling, it's entitled "The Mussolini Muscle," but is about that legislation of February 1929 of Primo de Rivera, and what it says is basically Spanish public opinion just kicking Primo de Rivera. But it's interesting because it's the Spanish dictator. It is never named as Primo de Rivera as a Spanish dictator. And the reference is to Mussolini, so you can tell, you know, because the British public would know who Mussolini was, but maybe Primo de Rivera wasn't that clear. And but anyway, this sort of totalitarian turn has some implications beyond the Spanish borders. Just to finish, what is going on in both places in 1929? Because this is sort of a crucial year for that dictatorship of Primo de Rivera. Well, in the case of Spain, we have a process of radicalization in both the sort of the repressive measures taken by the government after January 1929, whereas in the Italian case, by then we have a process of moderation, and as well in the use of political violence as well. That for years Mussolini had been saying, well, we have to integrate the militia within the state, and we have to take a much more of a moderate drive. We have, in the case of Spain, social Catholics abandoning the sinking ship, if you want, abandoning the Unión Patriótica, whereas it's just in 1929 when, out of the Lateran agreements, is not only that the party is getting more and more Catholics inside the institution of the government, but as well that you know, the Vatican is physically integrated within the fascist state. And as well, what is going on here is that the Unión Patriótica is enabled to be somehow merged with the state apparatus, whereas by the end of the 1920s, this is actually already happening in the case of Italy. So what we have just to finish would be, well, the end result is the dismissal of Primo de Rivera, as we know, and this is a cartoon published in Simplicissimus, a German magazine, in which Vittorio Emanuele is actually calling Alfonso XIII and asking, you know, say, hey, here, Vittorio, tell me, Alfonso, how did you manage to do it? How do you dismiss a dictator, right? How do you, manage to just get rid of this man? So yeah, that's basically it. So just to summarize the thing, in the case of what I think in this sort of very, very short paper, what we could see here is that in the case of Spain, we began with a coup d'etat, but a party created from above that actually led to a low commitment of that support for the party, insofar we can measure those things, obviously. In the case of Italy, we have a party that is created to take power with high levels of commitment, and actually, well, I wouldn't go into that now. As the regime developed in Spain, the supporters were being alienated from the construction of the state, of the new Primo Riverista state, and it's actually the other way around. Different conservative groups are integrated further, in many cases, into the construction of the fascist dictatorship. And at the very end, and yet a bit of an irony, the Spanish regime ended up radicalizing, whereas by then the Italian regime is sort of moderating in the late 1920s.
Okay, so now comes the most exciting moment, which is the debate, the discussion moment. Well, I'm the discussion, so I have to say something before. Well, after these three great papers, we have this time, and to start the discussion, I will raise a single issue with several questions. The dictatorships analyzed here are separated by many differences, but they share a common feature: their Catholic character, in Portugal, in Austria, and of course in Spain. Here, Catholics have appeared in leading roles. First, as transnational agents spreading the Portuguese corporate model and its Catholic dictator and the Catholic dictatorship. Second, as member of the Christian Social Party and the paramilitary forces that brought about the Austrian dictatorship. And third, though Alex hasn't talked much about the Catholics, but in the paper they are everywhere. So, as one of the fundamental bases of Primo de Rivera's regime, whose detachment partly explains its final crisis. So, however, I would like you to say a little more, elaborate a little more about the role of the church as an institution, both global, transnational, and national. How important do you think were the church, the hierarchy of the church, the bishops, headed by the Pope in the theoretical elaboration and justification of authoritarianism in the interwar period? What role did religious actors play in the legitimization of dictatorships with the loan of their sacred symbols and their participation in ceremonies and rituals with political undertones? And to what extent can we speak of a Catholic authoritarian model? I don't want to go back to the old-fashioned debate about this is fascist, this is not fascist, but are there particular Catholic values and ideas in these examples? Is there a Catholic authoritarianism? That's my questions. Would you want to answer by order, or what, Antonio?
Yeah. Wow, it's a big question.
But only one?
Yeah, but only one. There are two. I'm going to answer that question with two bibliographical references. Two recent, let's say published in the last 5 to 6 years, on an attempt to analyze the global role of the Catholic Church in terms of authoritarianism versus democratic political systems in the interwar period. One by an American from Italian descent, Juliana Chamedes, and the other one by a U.S. historian. They converge in one element, I think, global, of course, global. The Vatican, because national Catholic churches are a bit, the Vatican. Undoubtedly, the Vatican, what we could call the ideological apparatus of the Catholic Church, okay, the Jesuits, let's consider that. There is a strong support to authoritarian regimes that, above all, has as political program to withdraw elements of Republican secularization and democratization of this so-called, first wave of democratizations. So not just law and order, of course, law and order, divorce, religions, elements in the educational system, etc., etc., etc. And we realized that, second, support globally to the authoritarian turn of Catholic parties. The Austrian case, it's an example of Dollfuss, or of Salazar. I'm just, to avoid the radicalization of the Spanish Civil War, blah, 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 blah. So, I said yes. On the eve of the war, I think, like 1940, and I was quoting this citation from an Irish Jesuit priest. There is a much more cautioned approach of the official church in terms of fascist radicalization. Even if by fascist radicalization, the war, the Axis rule, anti-Semitism, and other dimensions of fascist radicalization, let us say, associated with, even if, by obvious reasons, national Catholic hierarchy, Slovakia is a clear example, where the Vatican is very much worried with the cooperation of Tiso and with the Nazis, and we have access to all the diplomatic. They are worried with that. They don't know what to do. They are worried with that, and of course a dynamic of Russia of radicalization, because of course by the reasons we know that Slovakia and Croatia is exactly the same, etc., etc. What is curious, I think, but that's another story, maybe Daniele Sarapiglia can is how in certain areas of the globe, during the war, and especially after the war, there is a clear let us say, break because conservative Catholics, already without the support of the Vatican, conservative Catholics at the national level, and Christian democratic, let us say, Catholics, this is very clear in Latin America, still working on this model of organic democracy, a sort of a post-fascist era type of authoritarian regimes. It's difficult to answer to your question. In the specific case of Portugal, to conclude, is very interesting. Why? Because the Catholic Church everywhere, I think it was, Alessandro with Primo de Rivera, and clashes over education, of course, and over sometimes even the single party, etc. Because these regimes, even those who are more radical right-oriented, they want to build national youth organizations that are provoking problems with the Catholic civil society organizations, etc., etc. That's a clear tension. Militias that are not Catholicized, in the case of Portugal, the solution is negotiation. We are going to put Catholics in these organizations. So the national youth is fascist-oriented, but with lots of priests. And not connected with the party, but connected with the state. In the case of the militia, the same. More military, because we trust conservative reactionary military, not fascist from below, plus Catholic priests. So, and it's, in a way, I'm sorry to conclude, even if there are, of course, pro-democratic, decisions within the Roman Catholic Church, the support is there till the colonial war, 1960. 1960s is always there. Always there.
Okay. Well, I think very influential. A lot of the places we've talked about are in Catholic Europe. I said I wasn't in a Latin space, but Slovakia, Austria, Croatia are outside Latin space, but still in Catholic Europe. Ignaz Seipel himself, who went a long way towards moving the Christian Social Party to authoritarianism, was a priest, not just a Catholic. But there was no real active part by bishops and archbishops and theologians necessarily in the authoritarian state. It reminded me of Austria in the 1850s, post-revolutionary Austria in the 1920s. It was like after the 1848 revolutions, the church was lauded and privileged again. Austria became very Catholic. The church had its say in everything: education, youth groups, and so on. But not directly necessarily in government. It wasn't theocratic in that sense. It seems to me that as mass popular politics emerges in Catholic Europe, the main conservative party in lots of places shapes up to be a Catholic party. Partito Popolare, Popular Party in Spain, the Christian Social Party in Austria, they're Catholic mass parties. So I think, and they appeal to the pious, and the kind of aspirational respectability of the part of the population that they look to for support. So it's the church is the establishment. I think it's as simple as that. It might not be more sinister than that. And of course there is this approach by the Vatican itself, which is to first of all pretend modernity isn't happening with Pius IX, then with Leo XIII to promulgate this social doctrine, which is actually renewed in 1931. Quadragesimo Anno is a restatement of the principles of Rerum Novarum. So if you're a devout, respectable Catholic, where would you look to for authority and guidance than the church? I think, but I wouldn't say it's any more than that, really.
Yes, I think we've come, in a way, a long way from the days in which we thought that Catholicism as such could not or didn't sort of mingle, didn't mix very well with fascist regimes, and which in some respects was a creation, a post-1945 creation, right? The idea that, this regime cannot be fascist because, the Catholic Church is properly inside the regime, and therefore, but I think in historiographical terms, that's gone, and gone for good. And now we understand things in a much more sort of nuanced and complex way in some respects, but there is no doubt that Catholics, as in human beings, and Catholic values can be incorporated or be part, or a nuclear part as well, of a fascist regime without that being extremely problematic. A different matter is whether those members, those fascists, are also clerical or not, which is another debate. But in the 1920s and in the 1930s, I think there are a number of ideas and a number of values, both in the Vatican, and this is a changing situation, of course, but both in the Vatican, but as well in the Italian Church, and as well in the Spanish Church in particular, that they fit quite well within authoritarian political structures. And I'm talking about hierarchical conceptions of society, the very idea of a dogma that you don't challenge because it's sort of a revealed truth, anti-Semitism of the 1920s and 30s, fairly important in some quarters, and as well the corporatist conception of the state in some respect. It doesn't mean that the Vatican would prefer the Italian model of Giuseppe Bottai to the Belgian model of a Catholic corporate state. Probably not. But what I'm saying is that those factors are factors that they can work pretty well in an authoritarian regime, whether fascist or not. And in the case that of Spain and Italy, I think as these are bottom line historical processes, and in this respect, I think that in the case of Spain, the Catholic Church was a structural and integral part of the dictatorship at the very beginning, and full support. But actually, as the Primo Riverista state develops, because they don't want, let's put it this way, that they want essentially the army and to that sort of crucial articulating role as opposed to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, or at least partially, they ended up sort of separating, detaching, diverging from the dictatorship, whereas in the case of Italy, I think it's exactly the opposite.
Okay, so I have to ask the organizers if we can have more minutes, 15 more minutes, for example, just to have a discussion now until 6 o'clock. Is it possible?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, he is the boss. So.
No, I mean, I guess it's...
Okay, first ones. Go ahead.
Just stand
Yes,
up?
yes,
Okay.
we can.
Thank you. Thank you for your very interesting presentations. I have two questions for Professors Costa and Kirk. I have very brief questions. So I'm interested very much on the economic policies of the Portuguese and Austrian regimes. The first question would be, was there an association between moderation and austerity politics in those regimes, at least in the Austrian case? Or or was there a question of timing? So 1920s is more associated with austerity, 1930s is different because of the Great Depression. The second question is I'm curious about whether in Portugal or in Austria, was there any, when it comes to economics, was there any reflection on autarkic policies? Were there any policies on that regard? Thank you.
We are going to collect the questions from Theatre 3. Yeah, second one here.
Thank you very much. Very well aligned in terms of themes. So I suppose that's a praise for the organizers. I mean, I could ask 10 questions, but 1.5, let's put it this way. To Alex, I'm fascinated by this case, as you probably found out already, but Primo de Rivera. The Mussolini that Primo de Rivera encounters in 23, and I don't mean encounters when he goes to Rome, I mean in terms of the image, is a very different kind of setup to Mussolini in 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. So I'm thinking always that, you know, he puts, and we were talking about this, he puts his money in 23 on something that is really untested. You know, it's like, it's very new. And actually, technically, I can't remember who was saying, it was probably Antonio, he's not even in charge of a whole, you know, dictatorship at that point. How much does his understanding of Mussolini evolve as the image of Italian fascism and fascist Italy evolve post-1925, obviously, or this kind of things? I think I'll probably stop here because then I will probably abuse my
Okay. I'm following up from Aristotle. I'm also very interesting, as you know, about the comparison between Italy and Spain. It's very interesting for me, this paradoxical nature of this encounter, as you called it, in terms of Mussolini being more or less the more traditional, in a more traditional situation than Primo de Rivera, in some way, vis-à-vis liberal institution in 23. I wonder if there could be more articulation of the relationship between or the comparison between Primo de Rivera and Mussolini vis-à-vis Catholicism and the church with regard to the way in which Mussolini enforced negotiation or privileges to the church starting right from the 23, which actually led to the Lateran. And with this regard, I was I probably agree more with the formulation of the switch that happened in Italy in 29 in the paper than in the talk. That means that I can't really see a moderation of Italian fascism in 29.
Okay, so Antonio?
Before I answer, if I may, I wanted to ask two questions, if you don't mind. One, sorry, no, 2 seconds. One for Alex, if he could say a bit more on the project of constitution, and to Tim, one question that in a way puzzles me because I don't have enough information on that. And the question is the following. After the Anschluss, we know that Austria is, of course, integrated in the German political system in a way. But it is, do they have regional institutions? What is Austria in 1939? Right, so that's it. Okay, on the question of economics and the relation between economics, autarky, and autarkic policies and corporatism, as you know, there is a huge literature. And worse than that, many ideologues and technicians who are going to implement corporatist institutions do, because they want to avoid the relation with Italian fascism, they admire the New Deal. But in the end, they write authoritarian constitutions. And they design institutions to control labor that they simply are not there in the United States in the New Deal. But they quote a lot of the New Deal. That's the case, for instance, in Brazil, Oliveira Viana, one of the main architects of an intellectual as well, but one of the main architects of course. In the case of Portugal, there are two interesting dimensions. First, Portugal is a country that in a way escapes to the international crisis of 1929 simply because the economic structure have very few links with the global market and, of the world economy in that period. So all the introduction of corporatist legislation, it's based on this economic intervention and the attempt with resistance, of course, but that's everywhere. In Italy is there, in Japan is there, in Brazil is there, in Portugal is there, of entrepreneurs. So they're going towards labor, and that's it. They built the corporatist system in terms of labor, in unions, etc. But in terms of entrepreneurs and commercial associations and industrial associations, things are much more complicated. But in the case of Salazar, it's clear. First, an autarky model. Second, related with that, an economic intervention in society, more in agriculture than the more modern segments of the economy. In agriculture, the corporativization is a sort of totalitarian dynamics. Everything is controlled. From prices to production to associations to, of course, in other areas, no. So it's not just the pragmatic attitude of answering, let's say, a crisis and then forget it. No. There was this association between a political regime and a type of intervention that just changes in the 1960s, of course, but that's another story.
In terms of austerity, I think it's there. They do it because they can, and it's the same thing in Germany with Brüning and Papen. That basically you have an authoritarian conservative dictatorship, essentially, which can institute policies that leave the poor. And if you have a kind of corporate ideology of hierarchy and deference, the poor are always with us. Whereas the reflation of the economy that comes afterwards in Germany and then by 1938 in Austria, and it does persist. They carry on with the deflationary policies until 1938, comes for different reasons. One, I think, is the difference between conservatism and fascism within the regime, which is that fascism always takes more account of a popular dimension, and certainly in Germany there is this kind of stab in the back myth that if you don't keep the workers happy, it will happen again. They believe their own propaganda, and Hitler was talking about that in 1939. If I don't feed the Germans, they'll have another revolution. In terms of autarky, not by Catholic intellectuals in Austria, but certainly by the very many folkish intellectuals who were also around, but not necessarily in Austrian terms, because one of the things, and maybe didn't stress this enough, is that there was no Austrian nation. It was hypernationalism without a nation. So they think about it in terms of Großdeutschland. You know, if we're in a great Germany, autarky might make more sense. But certainly in terms of a European New Order, autarky would work even better. Do you want me to?
Yeah. Something briefly, because we
yeah,
can
sure.
have another
Another round.
Okay.
Okay. Well, Aristotle, you're absolutely right that what Primo Rivera is doing in terms of addressing or presenting Mussolini as the leader, the guide, the light. I think that's the term that he uses. The day of the coup d'etat is for European counter-revolutionary forces. It's a bit of a gamble, but it is also true that in September 1923 he's presented as such, as he had an influence, at least, you know, for over a year. So presented as, you know, everybody knows. I don't need to explain, you know, obviously who he is, but I say, well, he's been the leader of or an example for all of us. This change, I think, from April 1924 in many respects, because when he tries to create a political party for the regime, which is the Unión Patriótica, he first tried to do it with the more sort of fascistic groups, especially in Barcelona. And he realizes, and he had to send his number two, Martínez Anido, to negotiate with these people, and he realizes that, okay, they're very sort of fascistic. They look, you know, they go given the Roman salute and blue shirts and the rest of it, and goose stepping, but they're not many. And he needs like a proper structure. So then he goes for the social Catholics that actually are able to give him, at least in Aragon and in Castile, sort of a proper structure for the dictatorship. Having said that, it's an admiration that never died. It's everlasting till the very, very end. And it will be constant, the very idea that Mussolini is the guy, Mussolini is the person too. And I think there was some personal trust as well, because it's in the summer of 1929, he sent the proposal or the constitutional draft to Mussolini for consultation. So I would imagine that, you know, is this sort of a two-way traffic? No, I mean, I don't think Mussolini had any sort of admiration for, but it's, you can find comments on Mussolini by Primo de Rivera all the way through that dictatorship. But the most intense phase is, ironically maybe, the phase in which he is at the very beginning, when the dictatorship is not there. But again, presented as something that has already happened. Now, it's and then he lies a lot. I mean, you know, the dictators do these things. So they say, "Oh, I've been influenced by Mussolini quite a lot," and but not in the corporate estates that we have created in Spain. And actually, probably the most fascistic thing that Primo de Rivera had in terms of a state building was the corporate estate. So it's, and you know, so in that respect is you know, there's another problem, but obviously you cannot always trust what they're saying. Now, in terms of the moderation of the regime, yeah, probably I oversimplified that. The thing, what I meant is that Mussolini, and by 1929, I think for some time then, had been saying that the political violence and the acting of the militias had to be integrated within the police and within the state, and this is essentially what Primo de Rivera is doing, is just to given the Unión Patriótica and the Sumaten the possibility of arresting people, of using violence, of breaking into political meetings, and I think in that sense it's sort of a different sort of direction rather than I meant it in that particular respect. I'm not saying that the regime as such is moderating, but in the use of the party and the militia, I think the Mussolini had been telling them for some time. A different matter is whether he managed to do that or not. But the idea was to integrate them within the state, but within a certain legal framework. And this is sort of creating a different legal framework in the case of Primo de Rivera for the militia. And as for the constitution, well, this is created by a section of the National Assembly by a sort of a different use of right-wingers. Is essentially
National Assembly or Constitutional Assembly?
No, it's the National Assembly.
It's a constitutional section.
Yeah, it's called So a bunch of or a group of members of the assembly, they created that, but no one likes it, not even themselves. I mean, the drafters of the constitution, let alone the king, Primo de Rivera for different reasons. So it's a final sort of it's probably the last attempt to
Well, I don't know if there are
We have
some final questions.
Yeah, but
Yes, okay. Don't sacrifice yourself, please. Okay, no more questions? So it's clear now that some people find characters as Primo de Rivera, Salazar, and Dollfuss fascinating. So it's not everything is not lost. So thank you very much. Thank you. See you tomorrow.